March 6, 1945, Cologne, Germany. 3:47 in the afternoon, near the shadow of Cologne Cathedral. Amid the shattered buildings and smoke-filled streets of central Cologne, a German tank crew waited in silence. Inside their Panther tank, Feldwebel Karl Hoffmann leaned forward, pressing his face toward the damaged optical sight. The periscope glass had fractured earlier in the fighting, its surface now a web of fine cracks that distorted everything beyond it. Still, Hoffmann forced himself to focus. Something was moving through the debris ahead, slow, deliberate, unmistakably armored. For years, he had trained himself to recognize enemy vehicles in seconds. The American M4 Sherman was instantly familiar, tall, boxy, armed with a short 75mm gun that German crews rarely feared. The lighter Stuart tanks were even less concerning, fast, thin-skinned machines often dismissed as curiosities rather than threats. Even the reinforced jumbo Shermans, heavier and better protected, were known quantities. None of them could reliably penetrate a Panther or Tiger from the front at meaningful distances. But what Hoffmann saw now did not fit any of those profiles. The silhouette was lower than expected. The armor appeared sharply angled, not assembled from flat welded plates, but shaped and sloped to deflect incoming fire. Most alarming of all was the gun, long, thick, and clearly more powerful than anything previously mounted on an American tank. The turret looked oversized, dominating the hull beneath it, as if a battlefield artillery piece had been adapted for armored combat. Hoffmann hesitated, then spoke into the intercom. His voice, usually calm and precise, carried a strain his crew had never heard before. "That is not a Sherman." At that moment, he did not yet know the designation of the vehicle confronting them. What he did not realize was that within less than half a minute, his crew would become some of the first German tankers to encounter a new reality of the war. The United States had fielded a tank capable of destroying German armor decisively, regardless of distance or angle. Another Panther crew had already learned this truth only minutes earlier. Roughly 3 minutes before Hoffmann's sighting, a Panther commanded by Unteroffizier Wilhelm B. of Panzer Brigade 106 engaged the same unknown enemy. There was no radio report, no warning transmitted. The encounter ended almost instantly. The American tank, an M26 Pershing, fired first. Its main weapon, a 90mm M3 gun, launched an armor-piercing projectile at a muzzle velocity exceeding 850 meters per second. The distance between the two vehicles was approximately 120 meters. The shell crossed that space in a fraction of a second, striking the Panther directly on the turret front. German tank doctrine had long relied on the strength of frontal armor. The Panther's turret face, measuring around 100 millimeters thick, had resisted countless hits from Allied guns throughout France and Belgium. Against this new weapon, however, it was insufficient. The shell punched through the armor, carried its energy into the fighting compartment, and detonated inside the tank. The crew had no chance to escape, nor time to understand what had happened. This moment represented more than a single loss on the battlefield. It marked the collapse of assumptions that had defined German armored warfare for years. Victory in the Second World War was increasingly determined not only by tactics or bravery, but industrial capacity, engineering choices, and the relentless arithmetic of production. On the streets of Cologne, those abstract numbers took physical form in steel, fire, and shattered armor. Since the first Tiger tanks appeared near Leningrad in August 1942, German heavy tank crews had operated with a sense of technical dominance. Their vehicles seemed to overturn established rules of armored combat. The famous 88mm guns could destroy enemy tanks at distances well beyond 2 kilometers. Front hull armor measuring roughly 100mm and even thicker protection on the turret rendered them nearly invulnerable to the standard weapons carried by Allied tanks during much of the war. For over 2 years, this advantage shaped both strategy and psychology. German crews believed with reason that they could see the enemy long before the enemy could threaten them. That belief now faced its first serious challenge. On March 6, 1945, among the ruins of Cologne, the technological gap that once protected German armor finally closed. And for the men inside those tanks, the realization came not through reports or briefings, but through the sudden, violent impact of a shell they could no longer ignore. The impact of Germany's heavy tanks during World War II went far beyond steel and firepower. Their greatest strength was often psychological. Crewmen from units such as Schwerpanzerabteilung 506 later recalled that commanding a Tiger tank created a deep sense of dominance on the battlefield, as if the machine itself granted immunity from destruction. From a purely technical standpoint, the numbers supported that confidence. The standard American M4 Sherman, armed with the 75mm M3 gun, stood little chance against a Tiger from the front. Penetration of the Tiger's frontal armor was only possible at extremely close distances, often less than 100 meters, and even then required ideal angles and specialized ammunition. By contrast, the Tiger's famous 88mm KWK-36 gun could destroy a Sherman from distances approaching 2,000 meters, well before American crews could effectively respond. As the war progressed into late 1944, German tank commanders refined tactics that took full advantage of this imbalance. Tigers and King Tigers were positioned at long range, where their superior optics, thicker armor, and powerful guns allowed them to engage Allied armor with near impunity. In many engagements, a single heavy German tank was capable of halting an entire armored advance, forcing Allied units to maneuver cautiously or withdraw altogether. One of the most dramatic demonstrations of this dominance occurred in Normandy during June 1944 near Villers-Bocage. In a brief but devastating action, SS Commander Michael Wittmann, operating a lone Tiger, destroyed numerous Allied vehicles in rapid succession, dozens within minutes, including tanks, anti-tank guns, and transport vehicles. Although Wittmann himself would be killed later that summer, his actions became emblematic of the fear and respect inspired by German heavy armor. This battlefield reputation produced lasting psychological consequences. Allied tank crews began to experience what historians later called Tiger panic, frequently identifying any German tank as a Tiger and reporting encounters far exceeding the number actually deployed. On the other side, German heavy tank crews increasingly believed in their own invulnerability, celebrating confirmed kills with painted rings on their gun barrels, mirroring the traditions of fighter pilots. Yet while this belief flourished at the front, a very different reality was taking shape thousands of kilometers away in the United States. In industrial centers such as Detroit, American engineers had already recognized a critical problem. As early as September 1942, work had begun on a new tank design under the designation T-26, an acknowledgement that existing American armor was no longer sufficient for the evolving battlefield. The roots of this problem lay in timing. The M4 Sherman had been designed in 1941 when Germany's most dangerous tank was the Panzer IV, still armed with a relatively low-velocity short-barreled gun. By the time American forces encountered Tigers in Italy and Northwest Europe, the Sherman was inferior in nearly every decisive category: armor protection, gun power, and effective engagement range. The development of what would eventually become the M26 Pershing represented an urgent and massive industrial effort. The program brought together 14 major contractors, hundreds of subcontractors, and tens of thousands of workers spread across more than 20 U.S. states. General Motors' Fisher Body Division, which had been manufacturing Shermans at the Grand Blanc Tank Arsenal in Michigan, was ordered to rapidly convert its facilities for production of the new heavy tank. This transition required sweeping changes. New turret casting methods were introduced, completely redesigned transmission systems were installed, and the most significant step was the integration of a 90mm main gun, something never before mounted on a standard American tank. Until then, weapons of this caliber had been limited to tank destroyers and anti-aircraft platforms. The 90mm M3 gun marked a turning point in American armored design. Derived from a proven anti-aircraft weapon, it fired a 24-pound armor-piercing projectile at muzzle velocities exceeding 2,800 feet per second. Its standard M82 APC round was capable of penetrating approximately 119 millimeters of armor at 500 yards, sufficient to defeat the frontal armor of a Tiger under combat conditions. More advanced ammunition, such as the tungsten-cored HVAP round, dramatically increased this capability, reaching penetration figures high enough to threaten even the heavily armored King Tiger. With the emergence of the Pershing, the long-standing myth of German heavy tank infallibility began to crack. For the first time, American crews fielded a vehicle that could meet German armor on roughly equal terms, technically, tactically, and psychologically. The balance of armored warfare in Europe was finally beginning to shift. The hidden arrival of America's first heavy tank. The emergence of the M26 Pershing was conducted under levels of secrecy rarely seen in American weapons development during World War II. Personnel involved in its construction were deliberately misled. At the Fisher Tank Arsenal, workers were informed they were assembling components for a refined version of the M4 Sherman, nothing more. To further protect the project, major parts of the tank were produced at different factories, ensuring no individual team could piece together the full design or purpose of the vehicle. When the initial batch of 20 Pershing tanks was approved for overseas deployment in January 1945, extraordinary measures were taken to conceal their identity. Official shipping records described them not as combat vehicles, but as oversized maintenance equipment. Each tank was fully covered and disguised, preventing dock workers or observers from recognizing what was being transported. On the night of January 15, 1945, at the New York port of embarkation, the operation moved into its most sensitive phase. Under strict security protocols and darkness, the 20 Pershings were loaded onto transport ships bound for Europe. Every vehicle was sealed in waterproof material and marked with misleading serial codes. Even the sailors aboard the ships were largely unaware of what lay in the cargo holds. The crews assigned to operate the Pershings had been selected months earlier and trained in total isolation at Fort Knox since November. They were bound by strict secrecy agreements, with violations punishable by court-martial. During the 11-day Atlantic crossing, through waters known to be patrolled by German U-boats, the tanks were stored deep within the ship, positioned behind rows of standard Shermans to avoid detection. Throughout the voyage, the tank crews maintained their cover identity as replacement personnel for conventional Sherman units. Their time was spent studying recognition manuals of German armored vehicles and rehearsing explanations in case they were questioned. Even among Allied forces, knowledge of the Pershing's existence was tightly controlled. The ships reached Antwerp on January 26, 1945, again unloading under the cover of night. From there, the tanks were transferred immediately onto specially assigned trains and transported to the 3rd Armored Division's maintenance zone near Düren, Germany. Final inspections and preparations were carried out at this location, while Major General Maurice Rose personally briefed senior officers on the deployment and intended use of the new tank. By February 25, 1945, the Pershings were ready for limited operational use. 4 of them were discreetly distributed among task forces advancing toward the Rhine River. Each task force received only one Pershing, embedded within standard Sherman formations. Command orders were explicit. The new tanks were to avoid engagement unless confronting German heavy armor. To reduce attention, the crews repainted their vehicles in standard olive drab and applied regular unit markings. Despite these efforts, the longer 90mm gun and lower silhouette made the Pershing unmistakable to experienced observers. German intelligence completely failed to detect the introduction of this new American tank. Despite possessing one of the most sophisticated intelligence networks of the war, the Wehrmacht remained unaware of the Pershing's presence. German command circles firmly believed the United States had committed itself permanently to mass-producing lighter tanks, assuming American industry lacked the flexibility to introduce a heavy tank without disrupting Sherman output. Combat soon revealed the Pershing's strengths and vulnerabilities. On February 26, 1945, near the German front lines, the first Pershing was knocked out in action. The T-26E3, nicknamed Fireball, was ambushed at close range by a Tiger I. An 88mm shell struck the gun manlet, killing both the gunner and loader. Remarkably, the tank was later recovered, repaired, and returned to service by March 7th, highlighting the efficiency of American battlefield recovery operations. As the days passed, German headquarters began receiving troubling reports. Crews described encounters with an unfamiliar American tank featuring thicker armor and an unusually long gun. One Panther crew reported being destroyed from a distance of approximately 1,800 meters by a single shot from an unidentified American vehicle. The recurring detail in these accounts was consistent, a gun clearly larger than the Sherman's standard armament. The most famous confrontation involving the Pershing occurred on March 6, 1945, in Cologne. The engagement near the Cologne Cathedral became the most extensively filmed tank battle of the war, recorded by U.S. Army Signal Corps cameraman Jim Bates. German forces had positioned their remaining armored vehicles around the cathedral square, using rubble for partial cover. Among them was a Panther tank commanded by Oberlieutenant Wilhelm Bartelborth of Panzer Brigade 106. Confident in his position and the Panther's firepower, Bartelborth believed the open square would give his crew a decisive advantage. At approximately 3:20 p.m., movement was detected near the destroyed Garyon Hotel. Through his optics, Bartelborth observed what he initially identified as a modified Sherman with an extended barrel. Assuming an easy kill at close range, roughly 300 meters, he ordered his gunner to fire. The Panther's first round struck the approaching tank's frontal armor. Instead of penetrating, the shell deflected upward in a burst of sparks. For a brief moment, confusion set in. That moment lasted only seconds. Staff Sergeant Robert Early, commanding the Pershing known as Eagle 7, had already locked on to the Panther. His gunner, Corporal Clarence Smoyer, aimed carefully at the turret mantlet and fired. The 90mm shell penetrated cleanly through the Panther's turret front, igniting stored ammunition. The tank erupted in flames. Footage shows a second German tank attempting to engage shortly afterward. Accounts differ whether it was another Panther or a Tiger, but it too was destroyed by a direct frontal hit from the Pershing. The entire engagement lasted less than 5 minutes. This brief clash permanently altered battlefield perceptions. It proved that American armored forces now possessed a tank capable of meeting German heavy armor on equal terms, both in protection and firepower. The arrival of the Pershing marked the end of a long imbalance on the Western Front and signaled a decisive shift in armored warfare. The sudden destruction of German armored vehicles near Cologne Cathedral sent shockwaves through the German military intelligence system. What initially appeared to be another localized battlefield loss quickly escalated into a broader crisis at the highest levels of command. Oberkommando West reacted with alarm, issuing immediate orders to all frontline units. Any encounter with unfamiliar American tanks was to be reported without delay, accompanied by precise descriptions of firepower, armor, and battlefield behavior. As reports began arriving, a troubling pattern emerged. Tank crews from multiple sectors described American vehicles that did not match any known Allied designs. These tanks were said to carry guns comparable to 90mm weapons and possessed frontal armor thick enough to withstand direct hits from Panthers and even Tigers. More alarming was the engagement distance. German crews claimed their tanks were being destroyed from well beyond 1,500 meters, a range at which they had previously felt relatively secure. Faced with evidence that contradicted years of assumptions, German commanders struggled to interpret what they were seeing. Unable to accept that the United States had fielded an entirely new heavy tank, many crews adopted an improvised explanation. They began referring to the threat as a long-gun Sherman, assuming it was merely an upgraded version of the familiar M4 rather than a fundamentally new design. This misinterpretation persisted for several critical weeks and had serious battlefield consequences. German units continued to apply tactics developed specifically for fighting Shermans, tactics that proved dangerously ineffective against the M26 Pershing. The German armored training and doctrinal system was caught completely unprepared. Panzer schools had no intelligence briefings on the new American tank. Recognition manuals lacked silhouettes or identification charts, and existing tactical doctrine was built around the belief that American tank guns were incapable of penetrating German heavy armor from the front. As a result, crews entered combat with outdated expectations and false confidence. By the middle of March 1945, approximately 20 Persian tanks were already operational in Europe, with additional vehicles arriving steadily. Numerically, this was a negligible force compared to the thousands of Shermans deployed across the Western Front. Yet the influence of the Pershing was not measured in numbers alone. Its presence introduced doubt. German tankers, once accustomed to engaging American armor with near impunity, now hesitated before every encounter. At long range, they could no longer be certain whether they were facing a standard Sherman or something far more dangerous. Combat outcomes reinforced this psychological shift. In limited number of engagements where Pershings directly confronted German armored units, the results favored the Americans. While the small sample size make definitive statistical conclusions difficult, the trend was unmistakable. More important than kill ratios was the erosion of German confidence. Uncertainty itself became a weapon. Industrial realities deepened the sense of inevitability. By early 1945, Germany was struggling to manufacture even 100 tanks per month under constant bombardment and material shortages. In contrast, American production capacity was operating on an entirely different scale. By the end of the war, the United States had produced over 2,000 M26 Pershings. One facility alone, the Fisher Body Plant at Grand Blanc, completed 1,739 vehicles. German crews who learned of these figures through interrogations or captured documents understood that they were not merely outmatched technologically, but industrially overwhelmed. Losses could be replaced by the Americans at a pace Germany could not approach, even during its strongest years. Further insight came from the examination of damaged Pershings and recovered components. For the first time, German engineers and tank specialists were able to study American heavy tank construction up close. What they found challenged deeply ingrained stereotypes about American engineering. The turret, for example, was cast as a single massive piece, something German industry had never achieved at such a scale. This alone reflected a level of manufacturing sophistication that was difficult to ignore. The power plant was equally revealing. The Ford GAF V8 engine delivered approximately 500 horsepower while maintaining a degree of reliability that German engines of comparable output struggled to match. The transmission incorporated advanced mechanical features that appeared excessively complex on paper, yet operated smoothly in practice. Technical officers noted that this was not a single breakthrough component, but a system where every part reflected thoughtful, forward-looking design. Several features had a particularly demoralizing effect on German crews. The Pershing's gun stabilization system allowed accurate fire while the vehicle was in motion, an ability German Tigers largely lacked. The powered turret traverse could rotate the turret a full 360 degrees in roughly 15 seconds, providing a significant advantage in dynamic engagements. Optical equipment matched German standards in clarity and precision, eliminating another presumed advantage. Perhaps most striking were the interior conditions. Compared to the cramped and austere interiors of German tanks, the Pershing offered noticeably better crew ergonomics. Ammunition was stored using wet stowage systems designed to reduce the risk of catastrophic fires, a problem that plagued German armor throughout the war. Even seemingly minor details, padding, interior lighting, and layout demonstrated a concern for crew survivability and comfort that German designers had long sacrificed in pursuit of battlefield performance. By the final months of the war in Western Europe, a quiet but devastating shift had taken place inside the German armored forces. News that the United States now fielded a heavy tank capable of matching and in some cases surpassing German designs spread rapidly through panzer units. This information did not arrive in a vacuum. It reached crews already exhausted by months of retreat, chronic fuel shortages, and an increasingly fragile logistical system. The effect on morale was immediate and profound. For years, German tank crews had continued fighting under desperate conditions, sustained by one powerful belief: even when outnumbered, their machines were superior. Tigers and Panthers were not merely weapons, they were psychological anchors. That belief was now gone. The appearance, or even the rumored appearance, of American heavy tanks erased what many crews considered their final advantage. German armored doctrine had long been built around a calculated trade-off. Numerical inferiority would be offset by technological dominance. Defensive lines were selected with the expectation that German heavy tanks could destroy American armor from distances beyond effective retaliation. Offensive maneuvers assumed that breakthroughs could be achieved with acceptable losses because German guns and armor outclassed their opponents. By early 1945, both assumptions were rapidly losing credibility. This collapse in confidence soon manifested in unexpected ways. Reports of mechanical failures increased sharply, but post-war analysis revealed that many of these failures were minor. Vehicles were being abandoned for issues that crews would have routinely repaired under fire only weeks earlier. Recovery teams encountered Panthers and Tigers left behind with loose tracks, thrown treads, or empty fuel tanks, problems that had once been considered inconveniences, not fatal defects. The machines had not changed. The mindset of the men inside them had. As American forces advanced toward the Rhine in late March 1945, German tank crews found themselves trapped in an impossible dilemma. Orders demanded that bridgeheads be held at all costs, yet the crews no longer knew what kind of enemy armor they were facing. Every distant engine sound raised the same question: were these familiar Shermans or something far more dangerous? That uncertainty transformed every encounter into a gamble with lethal stakes. Across the front, a consistent pattern emerged. German tanks that had once stood firm now disengaged at the first sign of contact. Defensive positions designed to resist for days unraveled within hours. Entire sectors collapsed, not because of overwhelming firepower, but because of hesitation, withdrawal, and loss of cohesion. In purely material terms, the presence of roughly 20 Pershing tanks among thousands of American armored vehicles was insignificant. Psychologically, however, their impact was crippling. The possibility of facing an American tank immune to traditional German advantages was enough to paralyze decision-making at every level. By April 1945, German armored resistance in the West was effectively disintegrating. Units that still possessed operational tanks frequently refused to initiate combat unless they could be assured that no American heavy tanks were present.
Since such certainty was impossible, offensive action largely ceased. Even defensive engagements were approached with extreme caution or avoided altogether. The fighting around Dessau between April 21st and 24th illustrated this new reality with stark clarity. Despite fielding functional Panthers and Tigers, German defenders adopted rigidly defensive postures and avoided long-range engagements. The American assault force, composed mostly of standard Shermans with a small number of Pershings mixed in, encountered surprisingly weak resistance. German crews repeatedly chose withdrawal over engagement, unwilling to risk confrontation with a potentially superior opponent. Even veteran tank commanders, men who had accumulated impressive records over years of combat, abandoned their vehicles rather than face the chance of encountering a Pershing. In some cases, mere rumors of American heavy tanks operating nearby were enough to trigger full-scale withdrawals. The armored force that had once stormed through France and pushed deep into the Soviet Union was now fighting a war of fear and uncertainty. As German resistance collapsed in the closing weeks of April and the first days of May 1945, tens of thousands of tank crewmen were taken prisoner. During interrogations conducted by U.S. Army intelligence officers, a clear and consistent theme emerged: the discovery that the Americans possessed heavy tanks capable of challenging German designs marked a psychological breaking point.
Veterans repeatedly explained that for nearly 3 years, their confidence had rested on technological superiority. Even during retreats, even when vastly outnumbered, they believed their Tigers and Panthers ensured relevance on the battlefield. The realization that this advantage no longer existed transformed the war in their minds from difficult to unwinnable. Ironically, many of these crews had never encountered a Pershing in combat, yet the fear of them shaped every tactical decision they made. Uncertainty, not knowing whether an approaching American column consisted of Shermans or Pershings, proved nearly as effective as actual combat in neutralizing German armored forces. Only after the war did many German tank crews come to understand the broader reality. By 1945, the United States had achieved an industrial scale of armored production that Germany could no longer match. The Pershing was not merely a new tank, it was a symbol of an overwhelming industrial and technological momentum that German forces could neither stop nor escape. By the time this truth became fully clear, the war was already over. Although the M26 Pershing arrived too late to alter the military outcome of World War II, its presence revealed a reality far more significant than battlefield statistics. Fewer than 310 Pershing tanks reached European soil before Germany's capitulation, and only around 20 of them were ever committed to direct combat. Yet, by October 1945, American industry had already completed more than 2,200 M26 tanks. This disparity between deployment and production was not accidental. It was a demonstration of industrial power rather than immediate military necessity. The scale of American manufacturing was unprecedented. Fisher Body's Grand Blanc arsenal alone rolled out 1,739 Pershings, while Chrysler's Detroit tank arsenal contributed an additional 473 units. Once production lines were fully converted, factories could assemble a Pershing in a matter of hours. In contrast, German facilities required weeks to complete a single Tiger tank. Over the entire duration of the war, Germany managed to produce only 1,347 Tiger I tanks and 492 Tiger II King Tigers. The factories themselves told a story of imbalance long before the tanks met on the battlefield. What truly distinguished the American effort was flexibility. U.S. plants seamlessly transitioned from producing the M4 Sherman to the much heavier Pershing without sacrificing overall output. This capacity to adapt while maintaining volume was something Germany never achieved. German planners had assumed that American numerical superiority came at the cost of sophistication. They were wrong. The Pershing shattered that assumption. For veteran German tank crews, the discovery of American heavy tanks marked a profound psychological turning point. These were not inexperienced soldiers prone to panic, but seasoned professionals who had survived years of armored combat. Many later described their wartime experience as divided into two distinct phases, before and after learning that the United States had fielded a true heavy tank. Before this realization, German crews still believed victory might be secured through technological dominance. Superior armor and firepower had been their strategic anchor since 1942. Afterward, that confidence evaporated. Combat ceased to be about tactical advantage and became a matter of survival. Crews increasingly focused on avoidance rather than engagement. This reaction was unique. German tankers had adapted to other Allied advantages. When confronted with overwhelming numbers, they refined tactics. When Allied air power dominated the skies, they moved at night and relied on concealment. But the emergence of technological parity in tank design, once Germany's final perceived edge, offered no adaptation, no workaround, no counter-strategy. Nothing captured this collapse of confidence more vividly than the fate of King Tiger units in the war's closing months. The Tiger II represented the apex of German armored engineering, nearly 68 tons of steel, frontal armor up to 150 millimeters thick, and a long-barreled 88 millimeter gun capable of destroying virtually any Allied tank at range. For much of its service life, it was effectively immune to frontal attack. Yet by April 1945, crews operating these machines showed increasing hesitation when encountering American forces. On paper, the King Tiger should have remained dominant over the Pershing. In practice, the mere knowledge that American units might be equipped with 90 millimeter armed heavy tanks was enough to induce paralysis. Tank commanders no longer knew whether they faced Shermans, vehicles they had learned to defeat, or Pershings, capable of threatening even their most formidable armor. Post-war investigations uncovered the depth of German intelligence failure. Despite extensive espionage networks and signals interception, the Wehrmacht had no awareness of the Pershing program until the tanks appeared at the front. More critically, German intelligence had fundamentally misjudged American industrial capacity. They recognized America's ability to produce large quantities of equipment, but assumed this volume required compromising quality. The idea that the United States could mass-produce heavy tanks without losing efficiency simply did not fit their worldview. By April 1945, German armored resistance in Western Europe was unraveling. Units that still possessed functional tanks often declined to engage American formations. In many cases, the mere report of American armor entering a sector prompted withdrawals, regardless of whether Pershings were actually present. Tank commanders increasingly sought to avoid contact altogether. Mechanical failures became convenient excuses. Minor breakdowns that would have been repaired in the field weeks earlier were now cited as irreparable losses. Crews frequently reported sightings of American heavy tanks in areas later confirmed to contain only Shermans. Fear had outpaced reality. Ironically, the Pershing's psychological impact far outweighed its actual combat record. While the tank held advantages over German designs in several areas, it was far from flawless. Its transmission suffered from reliability issues, leading to frequent breakdowns. The 90 millimeter gun, though powerful, fired more slowly than the German 88 millimeter. Its armor, while well-sloped, was thinner than that of the King Tiger. In purely technical terms, the Pershing was broadly comparable to the Panther, superior in some respects, inferior in others. It was not the invincible machine German crews imagined, but the effect it produced had little to do with armor thickness or penetration tables. It stemmed from a deeper shock, the collapse of long-held assumptions about American limitations. Meaningful statistical analysis is impossible given that only around 20 Pershings saw combat. Any attempt to calculate kill ratios or battlefield dominance is rendered meaningless by the small sample size.
What mattered was not measurable performance, but belief. German crews became convinced that the United States had achieved tank parity, or even superiority, and that belief reshaped their decisions more decisively than any technical specification ever could. By the final phase of the war in Europe, the mere expectation of encountering American M26 Pershing tanks began to reshape German behavior on the battlefield. In the closing weeks, surrender rates among German armored crews rose sharply, not always because of direct combat, but because of a growing belief that resistance had become pointless. Crews who might previously have continued fighting in Tigers or Panthers against American Shermans increasingly chose to give up when the possibility of facing Pershings emerged. The reasoning behind this shift was stark and brutally logical. Against Shermans, German tankers still believed their machines gave them a meaningful chance of survival. Against an American tank that might be their equal or possibly superior, there was no such margin. What had once been a calculated risk turned into what felt like certain destruction. This pattern repeated itself across multiple sectors of the Western Front. U.S. Army intelligence officers noticed an unprecedented trend by late April 1945. German tank crew prisoners were often arriving at surrender points before infantry from the same formations. This was a dramatic reversal of earlier wartime behavior, when armored crews were among the last to withdraw and frequently fought until their vehicles were destroyed or immobilized. The psychological shift was unmistakable. The effect was especially severe among German armored units recently redeployed from the Eastern Front. There, many crews had spent years fighting Soviet forces with a sense, sometimes justified, of technical dominance. Even against newer Soviet models, such as the T-34-85 and the IS-2, experienced German units had often achieved favorable kill ratios. These crews arrived in the West confident, hardened, and convinced that German engineering still gave them a decisive edge. One such heavy armored formation transferred westward in March 1945 after destroying large numbers of Soviet tanks, considered itself nearly unstoppable. Its crews viewed its combat record as proof of personal skill and technological superiority. Yet within weeks of operating in Western Europe, the unit's effectiveness declined sharply. Reports of encounters with American heavy tanks began circulating, and confidence eroded with alarming speed. What followed was a profound psychological rupture. Crews struggled to reconcile two incompatible realities: continued success against Soviet armor in the East and the possibility that the United States, already overwhelming Germany in manpower, industry, and logistics, might also possess armored vehicles as capable as German heavies, created a sense of facing an enemy that could no longer be overcome by any means. As combat reports, rumors, and intelligence briefings spread through the panzer forces, technical details about the Pershing became widely known. Each new piece of information further weakened morale. The stabilized main guns suggested superior firing accuracy on the move. The transmission design implied reliability and smoother handling. Even crew ergonomics hinted at a philosophy that valued sustained combat effectiveness rather than mere firepower. Some features struck German crews particularly hard. The presence of infantry telephones mounted on the rear of American tanks demonstrated a level of coordination between armor and infantry that German vehicles largely lacked. Wet ammunition storage, designed to reduce the risk of catastrophic internal explosions, revealed a concern for crew survival that many German tankers realized had been absent from their own designs. These were not just technical differences, they represented an entirely different approach to armored warfare. Gradually, a disturbing conclusion took hold. American engineers had not simply copied or caught up with German tank design. In several areas, they appeared to have gone beyond it. For crews who had been told throughout the war that German technology was inherently superior, this realization was deeply unsettling.
The final armored clashes of April 1945 confirmed a complete reversal of psychological dominance. Where Tiger crews once hunted Shermans with confidence and patience, they now operated under constant tension. German doctrine emphasized destroying the most dangerous enemy vehicle first, but uncertainty undermined this principle. Crews hesitated, trying to determine whether approaching tanks were lightly armored Shermans or heavily armored Pershings. Those moments of doubt often cost them the initiative and sometimes their lives, regardless of which American tank they ultimately faced. After the war, historians examining these engagements concluded that the Pershing's impact cannot be measured purely in destroyed vehicles. The relatively small number of Pershings deployed limits statistical comparisons. However, the psychological effect on German armored forces is consistently supported by both Allied intelligence reports and German testimony. Operational readiness data from the Western Front reinforces this interpretation. In the months before Pershing deployment, German tank units, despite shortages of fuel, ammunition, and spare parts, maintained comparatively higher readiness levels. After reports of American heavy tanks spread, readiness declined rapidly. A growing number of losses resulted not from enemy fire, but from vehicle abandonment and voluntary surrender. For years, German tank crews had relied on a single sustaining belief that their technology remained superior even as the strategic situation collapsed around them. That belief helped them endure overwhelming losses and relentless retreat. The appearance of the Pershing shattered this final psychological pillar. Once it fell, continued resistance no longer seemed rational. Decades later, this moment appears repeatedly in the recollections of German armored veterans. In memoirs and reunion discussions, many identified the discovery of American heavy tanks as the point when they understood the war was irreversibly lost. The same sentiment surfaces again and again. Technological superiority had been their last remaining hope, and the Pershing erased it. For men who had trusted German engineering above all else, the knowledge that American factories in Detroit produced tanks capable of matching Tigers was not just a military revelation, it was the end of belief. For years, German soldiers had been conditioned to dismiss the industrial democracies as weak, disorganized, and incapable of sustaining modern war. That belief collapsed when reality proved otherwise. By the final phase of the conflict, those very nations had not only matched Germany's technical capabilities on the battlefield, but had done so while retaining a crushing advantage in industrial output. This realization was far more psychologically damaging than battlefield losses themselves. What German tank crews never truly grasped during the war, yet would have shattered whatever confidence remained, was how early they were encountering only the first wave of American heavy tank development. The M26 Pershing was not an endpoint, it was a starting signal. Almost immediately, the United States began refining and expanding the design. One such evolution was the T-26E4 Super Pershing, armed with a modified high-velocity 90mm gun. Although only 25 of these vehicles were produced, at least one reached the European front and saw combat conditions. Even more formidable variants followed on paper and in metal. The T-26E5 focused on survivability, incorporating dramatically reinforced armor that reached thicknesses approaching 279 millimeters in critical areas. While it never entered mass production, 27 prototypes were completed. Beyond these stood entirely new concepts. The T-29 heavy tank, mounting a 105mm cannon, had already entered the prototype stage. Alongside it, the T-30, equipped with a massive 155mm gun, was under active development. This progression made one fact unavoidable. American armored design had not merely closed the gap with Germany, it was accelerating beyond it. And unlike Germany, the United States possessed an industrial ecosystem capable of turning prototypes into mass-produced weapons at a scale its enemy could never replicate. The true imbalance became unmistakable when examining production infrastructure. By April 1945, American tank manufacturing occupied more than 50 million square feet of factory space. The Detroit tank arsenal alone rivaled and, in some respects, surpassed the combined capacity of much of Germany's armored vehicle industry. Companies like Fisher Body demonstrated an industrial flexibility Germany never achieved, converting civilian automobile plants into full-scale tank factories in a matter of months. These developments carried consequences that extended far beyond armor thickness and gun caliber. The arrival of the Pershing triggered a profound psychological crisis within German armored units. For years, crews had been told they were fighting not only for victory, but for proof of German technological brilliance and racial supremacy. Nazi propaganda insisted that such superiority was innate and unchallengeable. The appearance of advanced American heavy tanks, built by a society the regime derided as racially degenerate, struck at the ideological core of that belief system. Nowhere was this shock more intense than among Waffen-SS tank crews, men chosen specifically for their ideological loyalty. These soldiers had internalized racial doctrine as moral justification for their actions. The Pershing's existence directly contradicted the worldview that sustained their motivation. If Americans were capable of producing tanks that matched or exceeded German designs, what credibility remained in claims of inherent superiority? That question lingered uncomfortably in the minds of crews facing these machines. From a purely numerical standpoint, the Pershing's combat record was modest. Of the roughly 310 vehicles shipped to Europe before Germany's surrender, only around 20 were confirmed to have engaged in direct combat. As a result, any attempt to calculate meaningful kill ratios is statistically irrelevant. Yet numbers alone miss the point. The Pershing's greatest impact was psychological and operational rather than tactical. German field reports indicate a noticeable rise in tank abandonments in areas where Pershings were believed to be operating. Even unverified rumors of their presence altered behavior. Surrenders among armored crews increased sharply once knowledge of the new American heavy tank spread. Overall, combat readiness within panzer units declined, influenced by many factors, but the awareness of American heavy armor played a measurable role. Ironically, German engineers had conceived designs that might have rivaled or surpassed American tanks. Projects such as the Panther II and the E-series concepts, including the E-50 and E-75, represented advanced thinking in armor design. However, these vehicles existed only as blueprints or incomplete prototypes by the time Pershings were rolling off American assembly lines. This contrast illustrated a fundamental divergence in wartime philosophy. German doctrine emphasized technical refinement and perfection in individual weapons. The American approach prioritized reliability, adequacy, and the ability to produce overwhelming quantities. Once the United States achieved technical parity with the Pershing while preserving its unmatched production capacity, the outcome of the conflict became mathematically inevitable. The shock of confronting American heavy tank capability left a lasting impression on German military thought. In the post-war era, Bundeswehr doctrine reflected a sobering lesson. Technological superiority could never again be assumed as a permanent strategic advantage. A deep respect for American industrial power took root within German defense planning, a perspective that continues to influence military thinking today. For some veterans, the lesson was deeply personal. Many former German soldiers who later emigrated to the United States cited what they had witnessed during the war, symbolized by machines like the Pershing, as a turning point. The ability of a democratic society to produce such advanced weapons while maintaining prosperity and personal freedom forced a re-evaluation of long-held beliefs.
To them, the American system proved not only militarily effective, but ultimately worth embracing. Today, the remaining examples of the M26 Pershing rest quietly in military museums across the world. They no longer move, fire, or intimidate, but their presence still tells a powerful story about American industry, wartime adaptation, and psychological warfare. One such Pershing stands at the Patton Museum at Fort Knox, positioned beside a captured German King Tiger. Museum notes often describe them as broadly comparable machines, yet those simple technical comparisons fail to convey the deeper transformation the Pershing represented at the very end of the Second World War. For many German veterans who later encountered these displays, the Pershing symbolized a profound shock. Throughout most of the war, German tank crews had fought with an unshakable belief in their technological edge. That belief was not entirely unfounded. German armor doctrine and heavy tank design had long outpaced American efforts. But the arrival of the Pershing challenged something far more important than battlefield statistics. It challenged confidence.
The M26 Pershing was not merely another armored vehicle entering combat. It marked the moment when American industry decisively shifted from producing adequate, reliable machines in vast numbers to delivering a tank that could directly confront Germany's best designs on equal terms, without sacrificing mass production. In this sense, the Pershing represented an industrial awakening rather than a single weapon system. Its actual combat record was limited. Only about 20 Pershings ever engaged German forces in active combat, making traditional performance metrics like kill ratios essentially meaningless. However, the broader deployment figures tell a much more revealing story. By the time Germany surrendered in May 1945, roughly 310 Pershings had already arrived in the European theater. By October of that year, total M26 production reached approximately 2,200 vehicles. When viewed alongside German output, the contrast is striking. Across the entire war, Germany managed to produce only around 1,347 Tiger I tanks and 492 King Tigers combined. In comparison, American manufacturing capacity proved overwhelming. Fisher Body alone produced over 1,700 Pershings, with Chrysler adding nearly 500 more. These figures were not lost on German intelligence or on German tank crews hearing rumors from the front. As reports spread of a new American heavy tank equipped with a powerful, long-barreled 90mm gun, morale among German armored units visibly eroded. This decline occurred not because Pershings were destroying vast numbers of German tanks, they were not, but because their very existence shattered a long-held assumption. German crews had entered the war convinced that superior engineering would compensate for dwindling resources. The Pershing demonstrated that this assumption no longer held true. By late April 1945, the final confirmed tank-versus-tank engagements involving the Pershing. At that stage, Germany was already collapsing militarily, but the psychological damage had been done. In a matter of weeks, from the Pershing's first combat appearance in late February to Germany's surrender in early May, the mental landscape of armored warfare had changed completely. German tankers who had once viewed themselves as hunters, armed with unmatched machines, now confronted the realization that they could be outmatched. They faced American tanks capable of defeating Tigers head-on, backed by an industrial system that could replace losses faster than Germany could maintain existing vehicles. This realization was as devastating as any battlefield defeat. The true achievement of the Pershing cannot be measured in destroyed enemy armor. With so few vehicles engaged, statistical evaluation is impossible and misleading. Instead, its success lay in undermining certainty. For years, German crews had endured overwhelming odds sustained by faith in their technical superiority. When American heavy tanks appeared, that faith dissolved. In this way, the Pershing accomplished something that thousands of earlier Shermans could not. It helped break the psychological resilience of German armored forces, not through numerical dominance or revolutionary tactics, but through undeniable proof. American engineering had reached parity, and American industry could sustain it. Many German tankers never knew the Pershing carried a gun capable of penetrating their Tigers until they encountered it in combat. When those guns finally fired, they marked the symbolic end of an era. The myth of German invincibility, carefully built over years of early war success, collapsed in the final weeks of the conflict. The legacy of the M26 Pershing offers enduring lessons about modern warfare. Technological superiority, no matter how advanced, is fleeting without an industrial foundation capable of supporting it. More importantly, it highlights how psychological factors can outweigh material realities. Fear, confidence, and belief often shape outcomes long before statistics do. In the end, the Pershing's greatest victory was not tactical but psychological. A small number of tanks helped accelerate the collapse of an armored force that had once dominated Europe. Standing today behind museum ropes, the Pershing remains a silent reminder that wars are not decided by machines alone, but by the systems, societies, and beliefs that produce them.